evening, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Tonight is our second annual and evening read. Tonight we'll be joined by an amazing set of authors ready to talk about their writing and the intersection of their writing with themes that are core to the mission of the New York Immigration Coalition. We're so excited to be here with you tonight, second year in a row. I'm Michael Hirshhorn, a proud board member, a really proud board member of the New York Immigration Coalition. Every day I'm incredibly grateful, incredibly aware that I am the son and the grandson and the great-grandson and the great-great-grandson and husband of immigrants to the United States, to Newark, to Baltimore, and to New York City. I want to thank a huge round of applause to the amazing NYIC team led by Heather Varian, Emily Nees, and Abigail Williams for pulling this magical evening together. And I'd also like to big time thank Jimena, my wife and true partner, in joining me and supporting this evening. Tonight we'll be joined by three incredibly talented writers who you'll meet in a second. They'll chat with us about their craft and how they see their pens and their keyboards uplifting immigrant stories. Tonight's authors bring to life narratives that are both unique and individual and also wildly universal. For those new to the New York Immigration Coalition, we represent more than 200 immigrant and refugee rights groups throughout New York City and New York State. We serve one of the largest and most diverse newcomer populations in the entire US. Since our founding in 1987, the NYIC has been dedicated to two things: building power and improving the lives of immigrant New Yorkers. We've evolved into a really powerful voice of advocacy for protecting the rights of immigrant communities, improving newcomer access to services, developing leadership, and expanding civic participation to respond to the ever-changing needs of immigrant communities. Let me take a minute to thank, from my heart, our sponsors for this evening: Akashic Books, Nancy Goldhill and Bob Master, the New York Writers Coalition, Singapore Unbound, the Shipment Agency, and We Are Chimney. And now, it is my honor to introduce our inimitable host for this evening, Jemima Wei. So Jemima is a Singaporean writer based in the Bay Area, where she is a 22-24 Stegner Fellow. Jemima is the recipient, you won't believe this set of accolades, all for one person, one talented writer. Jemima is the recipient of awards and fellowships from Columbia University, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, Singapore's National Arts Council, and Writers in Paradise. Jemima has been named one of Narrative's 30 Below 30 writers and recognized by the Best of Net anthologies. Her fiction has won the William Van Dyke Short Story Prize, has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize, and is published in Guernica, Narrative, and Nimrod, among other places. And amidst all this recognition, I was laughing to myself. In her spare time, Jemima is at work on a novel and 2 short story collections. So good evening, welcome everyone. We are so happy you're here, and over to you, Jemima.
Thank you so much, Michael. And it's such an honor for me to be here too, honestly. Thank you all for tuning in and spending your evening or your afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from, with us. What a joy to be here tonight, and what a treat to be able to spend this evening with these incredible authors. Again, my name is Jemima. It is really my honor to be introducing and moderating tonight's conversation. So just to give you guys an idea of what we're going to do today, we're going to begin with a short reading from each of these writers, followed by a conversation about their work. And if anyone in the audience has any questions or simply wants to show their love, do make use of the chat section, and we're going to try our best to get to them all. First up, it is my deep and absolute pleasure to introduce Porochista Khakpour. Porochista's debut novel, Suns and Other Flammable Objects, was a New York Times Editor's Choice, one of the Chicago Tribune's Fall's Best, and the 2007 California Book Award winner in the First Fiction category. Her second novel, The Last Illusion, was a 2014 Best Book of the Year according to NPR, Kirkus Reviews, BuzzFeed, Pop Matters, Electric Literature, and much more. Born in Tehran and raised in the Los Angeles area, Porochista currently lives in New York City. So over to you.
Technical difficulties. Porochista, can you unmute yourself really quick?
I thought I hit unmute. I'm so sorry. Did you guys not hear any of that? Let me do that again. Hi, it's a great honor to be with you all. I'm just going to read a short essay from my collection Brown album that came out in May 2020, and it's called 13 Ways of Being an Immigrant. Okay. 1. The year is 1983, and Cabbage Patch Kids are at the height of their popularity. You want one, but you know your parents can't afford it. A couple of years into living in this country, and they keep telling you they will go back to Iran soon, that the war will be over, that the revolution will be done, that you will be a refugee and alien no more. But for now, there is little money. At school, you know you are one of the few kids with less access to things, and you know the others are not from here either. You work with them to get out of ESL, and you try to act like kids who belong here, who have money. One way to do this is to have a Cabbage Patch Kid doll, but this seems impossible. Still, your mother takes you to Toys R Us, which seems like the greatest place on earth, second only to Disneyland, which you've only heard about since it also costs too much to go. At Toys R Us, several aisles are devoted to the Cabbage Patch dolls. If it were a farm, this area would be the Cabbage Patch. Their chubby faces peer at you from behind the plastic of their boxes. You have not considered which one you want because you don't think you will ever get one. Maybe an imitation at some point, one without a signature on the butt, which is how you've heard you know they're real. True Cabbage Patch Kids, the real ones, come with butt tattoos. You are looking at them longingly when your mother points to a section down the aisle. There's a big sign, sale. There's a whole section of Cabbage Patch Kids on sale, it turns out, and your mother is telling you they are in her budget, but she doesn't think they are the right ones for you. You are elated, then confused. Why would she think that? And then you look at them one by one, row after row. What do they have in common? They are black, all of them, the ones on sale. You think about it. They could be your adopted child. Why not? You're still too young to know how babies are made, so you don't think much deeper. You reach out to a pigtailed black one in a yellow tracksuit, and you tell your mother that this is your daughter. Her name turns out to be Clover Stephanie, and you still have her somewhere in storage. Her cheek is a bit scraped and looks white underneath. It bothers you, that fact. It bothers you also that you have Clover only because she was on sale, because she was black, but that was an important first lesson about America, so maybe it was worth it. 2. You want to be a good student, the best, in fact. One way to do this is to follow directions. In kindergarten, this is a big goal of yours since English is still new to you. One rule is that at lunchtime you must eat your dessert last. Dessert is usually a piece of fruit, but apparently it is hard for kids to obey this rule. Not you. You always get it right. Your best friend is a blonde girl named Angela, whom all the teachers love. She doesn't always play by the rules, but she always gets away with it. One day she eats her cantaloupe before her spaghetti. This shocks you. You try to tell her to stop it, that she can't do this, but she does it. Without any fear, a smile even. You tell her to stop or you'll have to tell on her. She smiles with a mouthful of cantaloupe. She's fearless. You tell her to stop right now because you are truly about to tell. She laughs, more cantaloupe on her tongue. You can't take it anymore. You tell on her. The teaching assistant is a big man named Mr. Mondo, and he is tough on the rules. He will take care of this. You walk right up to him, and as much as it pains you, point right at her. Angela's eating her dessert first, Mr. Mondo. At this point, Angela is still, a look of fright on her face. She's not taunting you anymore. Good, you think. This might teach her. Mr. Mondo walks with you to her. He asks her if she did it. She nods, sadly. Sorry, she says. He says nothing and pauses. Then he turns to you and looks angry. He says one word, snitcher. He walks away and Angela smiles and you begin to cry, and after you learn what that word means, and from the start you know it's bad, once again you learn a lesson about America. 3. Your best friend in second grade lives in the good part of town. So does almost everyone at your elementary school. You live in the bad part of town. No one you know lives there. Your dad drives a Pinto while your best friend's dad drives a Rolls Royce. She hates it. You go to her house. It is a mansion in the hills. She has so many expensive toys, numerous Cabbage Patch dolls, all white, even though she is Vietnamese. She was born in America, unlike you. Her dad drives a truck for a living while yours is a professor. Another lesson you one day realize. 4. The usual substitute teacher, the one everyone in your grade sees most often, makes funny jokes, and one is that he calls you my Iranian sweetheart. You hate this because you know Americans don't like Iran and you don't want to be singled out and teased, especially not because of being Iranian. But he always does this. Another teacher sticks his thumb in your mouth when he spots you sticking your tongue out at a friend. You don't know what it means, but it feels wrong. Years later, a science teacher offers you a massage after class. You decline. A few grades down, a German teacher tells you are so beautiful. He whispers it to you and you never come near him again. The same year, a librarian tells you about male and female plugs too eagerly, demonstrating over and over. Another teacher laughs when students say you look like Anne Frank and makes a joke about him looking like a German soldier. You remember his bad breath on your face as he laughs at you all over you. Are there Jews still in Iran, he asks you, but you don't answer. In America, adults are inappropriate, you realize. Maybe a lesson about this place, but maybe not. 5. You become editor-in-chief of your high school paper, your one and only dream in life, as far as you know it. For 2 years, you have this post. You love nothing more. When your advisor is fired, a gay man, you are incensed, and you walk out and your staff follows. You are now seen as a rebel. This somehow seems very American. Your fearlessness also seems very American. You are blonde Angela with the cantaloupe. You must belong here if you think you can afford to leave. 6. You go to college in New York, your dream, and you get your first internship at the Village Voice. You are a teenager and a scholarship kid, and you have no money, and it does not occur to you that students ask their parents for money. You're left wondering how you can make this work, so you learn to jump trains. Another scholarship kid teaches you. You get good at this. You go to your internship 3 times a week and use some change for dinner, Pop-Tarts from the vending machine, and then you jump the train back. Part of it is you must look well-dressed to do this. You pretend you are dressing up for your internship, but you are doing it because they suspect you less if you look fancy. One time you get caught. A female conductor. She tells you she's been watching you for months. You have no money to give her, so she tells you your luck is up and she's about to kick you off. It's midnight and the stop is Mount Vernon, a bad neighborhood. You are let out there and an old man offers you a drive home. You have no other choice. You stop jumping trains. 7. Sometimes you stay out all night. You miss the last train back to college upstate on purpose, knowing the next one is at 6 a.m. No worries. The clubs are open all night. You go to them and lose yourself in them. In America, you fit in at clubs more than anywhere else. They are for you. It's there that people accept you most. Very little matters in the forever night of a club, and you learn to trust darkness more than light. 8. You go on your year abroad to Oxford. You joke that you are doing it to dry out from drugs and drinking, but this is somewhat true. But there you find more clubs and more drugs and drinking. They call you American Express, that group of boys you sleep with. You're amazed they call you American. 9. At age 19, you are raped. At age 20, you are raped again. That strikes you as something that happens to American girls, a rite of passage. You tell no one, which American girls seem to do too, or not do. 10. You see 9/11 outside your East Village window, and you remember your first nightmares as a recent immigrant in the 80s. Men in dark clothing with machine guns and machetes loose on your city streets. They were terrorists, and you were the hostages. In your dream, it's always in Iran. In your dream, you are safe in America, but not in reality, you realize. Your old world has come for you. This is what being American looks like now, you think, as you take your shoes off in an airport security line for the first time. 11. You become a published author. No, American author. No, an Iranian-American author. Never does the hyphen seem to matter more than when you are an author, it seems. 12. In your teens, you contemplate suicide. In your 20s, you contemplate suicide. In your 30s, you contemplate suicide. Before turning 40, you wonder how many more times you will contemplate suicide. You wonder if you'd have been happier in that other life you were meant to live, the one where you stayed in Iran and maybe got married and had kids and maybe never became a writer. Maybe you would have already died of suicide. 13, the last section. You were 19 years an American. You become an American in November 2001, and you realize you could have had a child in that time. You have no kids, no husband, no home you own, no roots, no real reason to be here. Trump becomes president, and your old country is on the list of one of the 6 countries of the Muslim ban. You're suddenly a Muslim. No one doubts your brownness anymore. You realize that every day is a lesson in America, the real America, the violent one. You remember blonde Angela with the cantaloupe glistening in her laughing mouth, and you think for the first time maybe she was laughing at you. Why would you think you'd get anywhere? On Facebook, you beg your white friends to do better. You ask them for ideas on where to live. You try to imagine another future they have. You wonder if your Americanness is forever and if you will die an American. You realize it might be just as hard to shake being an American as it was to become one in the first place. You realize with joy that you will die an American. You realize with agony that you will die an American. You realize with horror and confusion and fear and disbelief that you will die an American. Somehow it is harder to imagine than dying. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. The line, "You must belong here if you think you can afford to leave," really struck me. And the second person you addressed was so incantorian and so intimate. The visceral betrayal from the authority and adults and the world really broke my heart. I have the same goosebumps I do when I first read those words. Thank you so much for starting us off. Next up, I am so pleased to introduce Zaina Arafat. Zaina Arafat is a Palestinian-American writer and the author of the novel You Exist Too Much, which won a 2021 Lambda Literary Award and was named Roxane Gay's favorite book of 2020. She teaches creative writing at Barnard College and the School of the New York Times and is currently at work on her second book. Zaina, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled by the work that you're doing as the daughter of Palestinian immigrants. It's just really wonderful to be a part of this reading tonight. I am, just FYI, I hope it's okay to share this, but I'm holding a bottle in the mouth of my 5-month-old baby because I'm just waiting for my partner to get home from work, but the ferry seems to be running a little behind. So I am going to read, and so if you hear some little baby noises in the background, that's why. I hope that's okay. I was going to read actually an excerpt from an essay that I wrote that is related to my father's experience of coming to the U.S. for the first time, first as a foreign exchange student, and then later as an immigrant. Okay, so the essay is called Our Arab, and I'll just read the first few pages of it. In the 1963-64 Wyndham High School yearbook, there is an entire page dedicated to my Palestinian father. During his 1 year as an exchange student in Wyndham, Minnesota, he played on the tennis team, ran track. He hated running, but the other option, wrestling, terrified him. Joined the photography club, was elected to student council. They entrusted me to make decisions for the entire school, he says, though I'd only just arrived. And got voted onto the homecoming court. We joke that he was the Forrest Gump of Wyndham, able to be everywhere all at once, and all in just a year. Extracurriculars didn't exist back in Nablus, he says, speaking of his Palestinian hometown. We were desperate for any kind of cultural or social activity. In the yearbook, he is referred to by his nickname, Winnie, short for winner, the English translation of his Arabic name, Fawaz. He is sinewy and boyish, gap-toothed, his nose still too big for his face. There is a shot of him woodworking, another of him standing poised behind an old-fashioned camera with a caption that reads, "What picturesque cheerleaders." There is a photo of him sitting beside an older man in thick, black-rimmed glasses, Glenn Tews, the junior high principal and his host father. Winnie learns the facts of American life, states the caption beneath it. The most jovial and ironic of captions accompanies a head-on shot of him standing beside a marked fallout shelter. Our own little bomb, it says. In the middle of the collage, in all caps and bold-faced type, are the words, Our Arab. The descriptions are naive, earnest at best, and would be deemed insensitive and offensive today. The voyeuristic and sexist implications of photographing cheerleaders, the patronizing assumption that a foreigner would be unfamiliar with such a thing as American life, associating an Arab Muslim with bombs, designating a student by his ethnic background in a possessive paternalistic tone. But in the early 1960s, the concept of political correctness hadn't yet infiltrated the American vernacular. It wouldn't until the 1970s, with the rise of the New Left exploding onto college campuses and into political discourse in the 1980s and early 1990s. Nor did identity, oh, whoops, just make sure that, oh, thank you. Nor did identity politics extend to Arabs and Muslims, who weren't yet considered victims of discrimination or excluded in the way that other minority groups in the US were, most notably African Americans, who were demanding equality by braving police dogs and water cannons and state-sanctioned racism via sit-ins, boycotts, and jail sentences. According to my father, part of the reason for this is that there weren't that many Arabs or Muslims around. People hadn't had much exposure to us, he tells me, which meant they had no pre-existing associations, judgments, or stereotypes yet. In Windham, the population was, and still is, almost homogeneously white, 92% so, comprised mostly of Scandinavian immigrants and their descendants. I don't remember any Mexican, Asian, or African American classmates, he says. A quick scan of the yearbook offers a spread of overwhelmingly white faces. I was the only foreign student at the high school, and possibly in all of Windham. In her essay, Back to Buxton, Eula Biss refers to Zora Neale Hurston's experience of becoming tragically colored when leaving her all-black hometown and entering a predominantly white America. I was not Zora of Orange County anymore, Hurston writes. I was now a little colored girl. Though my father stood out in Windham, his othering was surprisingly benevolent, friendly and exclusive, and unaware of its Orientalist gaze. Despite their lack of exposure to Arabs and Muslims, the Americans he met in Windham greeted him with openness and curiosity rather than suspicion and animosity. He speculates that this was maybe because we weren't yet maligned in the media. There were no Limbaughs or Coulters or Hannitys railing against, or Tucker Carlson's, railing against entire ethnic and religious categories of people. Nor were we a target of U.S. foreign policy or discriminatory domestic ones, he says. Indeed, there was no Patriot Act, no surveillance of mosques in Muslim neighborhoods, no travel ban, no inflammatory tweets by a sitting president designated to foment Islamophobia. My father's year in Windham was before 9/11, before Al-Qaeda, before Afghanistan, and before both Gulf Wars, before the Arab Spring, before the Iraqi and Syrian refugee crisis. My father now lives in the U.S. permanently as a citizen, just outside of Washington, D.C. CNN constantly blares from the living room television. Upset by the news and its reflection of a different America than one he first encountered, America where, to his mind, leaders sought to unite rather than divide, where hatred and bigotry were seen as things to eradicate rather than revive, where a set of shared values guided policy, and where American goodwill didn't come with a price tag, he keeps his Windham High School yearbook within reach, in the coffee table drawer. As the political pundits argue in the background over Trump's latest offense or unilateral move, when I visit the Middle East now, my father tells me, people say, it looks like America isn't sustainable after all. You've got a dictatorship too. This was during the Trump years. My father shows me a picture of his English teacher, Mr. Lindemann. At 27, Mr. Lindemann was sleek and sharp and bore a striking resemblance to a young Paul Newman. My father has spoken of him for as long as I can remember. He was the teacher who introduced him to his favorite authors and stories, ones he would not have encountered back in Nablus. As soon as my homework began to include reading, my father gave me all of the novels that Mr. Lindemann had assigned, Les Miserables, The Catcher in the Rye, The Glass Menagerie. I was the only fourth grader who chose to write a book report on of human bondage. When my father emigrated to California in the late 1970s for graduate school at the age of 31, his first time returning to the U.S. since high school, he tried to locate Mr. Lindemann. His search was unsuccessful, and he gave up. Not until 2014, 50 years after their last encounter, would an uncanny coincidence allow them to meet again and bring my father back to Windham. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that we're delighted to share this evening, both of you and your child. Yeah, I am in such admiration of your ability to move between the novelistic and essayistic mode and do them both so brilliantly. And I can't wait to get into, the nits and get into it with you later on in our conversation. Yeah. Next, I am delighted to introduce Patricia Engel, whose most recent novel is The Faraway World. She is the author of Infinite Country, a New York Times bestseller and Reese's Book Club selection, The Veins of the Ocean, winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, It's Not Love, It's Just Paris, winner of the International Latino Book Award, and Vida, a finalist for the Penn Hemingway and Young Lions Fiction Award. New York Times notable book and winner of Columbia's National Book Award, the Premio Biblioteca de Narrativa Colombiana. Born to Colombian parents and herself a dual citizen, Patricia is an associate professor of creative writing at the University of Miami. Patricia, please.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be a part of this evening and to follow these stellar writers in this wonderful lineup. So I'm going to read from my new book, which is a short story collection, The Faraway World. So I'm just going to read the beginning of a short story called Libélula, which means dragonfly in Spanish. The first time we met, you asked me to tea. It was at an Italian bakery not far from where you lived. You ordered for me a cappuccino and a chocolate pastry. You didn't want me to see your home yet. You confessed that later, months after you'd offered me the job to clean and supplement care for your baby, for the baby you planned to have, though you said you would also hire a nanny. You complimented my sweater and my nails. You asked if I painted them myself, and when I told you I did, you said you would pay me extra to do yours too. We were the same age, but you spoke as if much older, as if I were a child and you were my educator. You explained the neighborhood. When you showed me around your apartment a few days later, you presented your park views as if they were a blue blood family crest. Your husband was traveling. I would not meet him for several more weeks, but he participated in our discussions when you told me he liked his boxers ironed, his collars pinned, his shoes sorted according to hue. You'd met in infancy, you said. Your families knew each other for generations. You came to this country together for university and were permitted to live together with the understanding that you would marry after graduation, and you both complied. In another life, I might have also been your maid back in Colombia. You might have inherited me from your mother, who employed my mother, or I might have arrived at your door referred by one of my friends, who was employed by one of yours. I also came to this country with a man who pledged to marry me. In the end, I was the one who escaped vows and returned to Medellin because the country did not deliver on its promises. I didn't say any of this when you hired me. You only knew I'd been employed as a housekeeper for years by a Swiss family on the west side who'd relocated to Dubai. You wanted someone to work full-time, the way it was when you were growing up, not a once-a-week cleaner as was common around here. You wanted a woman to be there when you woke up, to serve your breakfast on the dining room table and disappear in the evening when your husband returned from work, and you would wait for him at the same table in an outfit you modeled for me earlier, asking if it was obvious that you'd gained a few pounds. You wanted a ghost, a shadow, to move about your home anticipating your every need, a double, as loyal as an imaginary friend, to accompany you potentially until your death, when I would be retired and return to my relatives. This proposal did not offend me because I was raised as you were, but on the other side of such an arrangement, and as you assured me when you offered me the position, I would be well compensated. You did not work and felt no shame about it. You were too busy to have a job, you said. You barely had enough time to get the sleep you needed with all your errands and appointments. You'd studied finance, but your husband managed your money, and his secretary called sometimes to go over charges on the credit card statements. You gave me cash and a push cart for grocery shopping. You liked for me to go to the market every day as if we lived in Europe, you said, or back home where the produce was fresh and not waxed and lifeless, as it is here. I cooked for you, though you complained my recipes were too simple. Beans, you said, were peasant food. You bought me cookbooks. You positioned me in front of the television to watch instructional programs of famous chefs. I was not a very good student and rotated the same few dishes I'd mastered every week, but I did your manicures and pedicures, massaged your shoulders, and brushed your hair as you told me that your husband was a reluctant lover, that his mother secretly despised you and you secretly despised her, that if you didn't have a baby soon, you feared he would leave you and you would have nowhere to go but back to Colombia, and you would rather die than return to your family without a husband or a child to show for your time abroad. I listened with the devotion of a nun, and so you let me stay. I came to this country at 23, the same year you married. My boyfriend was already here, working as a doorman in Long Island City. We rented an efficiency near St. Michael's Cemetery, and I found a job cleaning tables and counters in a cafeteria. When things turned bad with him, I went to live with a friend on Lamont Avenue. She was the one who told me about La Palmera, the dollar club on Roosevelt. Everyone does it at some point, she said. Harmless, fast cash. All I needed to do was wear party clothes and high heels and sit along the wall with the other woman until a man asked me to dance. $2 a song, $40 if he could commit to a whole hour. The men were mostly day laborers, rough-handed, often still in their work clothes. They would ask me to dance, and it was like the old days you hear older people describe, when everyone was well-mannered, when a dance and holding hands had nothing to do with sex. This is how it was until one of those men became aggressive or obsessive with one of the ladies, which happened from time to time, confusing payment with romance. There were security guards who looked out for us. The truth is I had no bad experiences there. It was a safe place for me, dark and full of lonely strangers who felt moved by human touch and conversation over cheap beer and watered-down cocktails. These men spoke of wives and children they left in their countries, wondering if there would ever be enough money to bring them over to justify the end of their American experiment and go back home themselves. Sometimes the men didn't pay, so I started collecting my cash before going to the dance floor the way a prostitute would do, though I did not see dancing for dollars as prostitution. Still, it was nothing I would ever tell anyone, even my mother, and especially you. But I came to see time as the measure of a song on a scale of money, and in my future jobs, I'd see my tasks as a series of tunes, the washing of dishes, the folding of laundry, the making of beds, equivalent to a set of salsa or bachata. I ran into a friend at El Mundo supermarket who told me about a studio share available in Manhattan. The apartment belonged to a woman who worked as a live-in nanny and used it only on weekends when the family didn't want her around. I could sleep in the bed all week and take the sofa on Saturdays and Sundays. She was the one who set me up with the family that led me to you. When I told you I lived up on 177th Street, you made it sound like Canada. You could not believe I took 2 trains and a bus to reach you all before you woke up each morning. You hated the subway. The bus was even worse. You could tolerate taxis if your life depended on it, but your preferred mode of transportation was a chauffeured car from the service your husband's company supplied without end. When you had the first miscarriage, you preferred to wait for the driver instead of taking one of the dozen yellow cabs that passed in front of the building. You folded into yourself. I held you by the elbow so you wouldn't spill to the ground. I'd helped you pad your underwear for the bleeding. You whimpered in pain. Your husband said he would meet you at the doctor, but it was 2 hours of you splayed on the table, releasing tissue before he arrived. You asked me to stay with you. You held my hand, and your eyes found mine when they weren't pressed shut. The doctor came in between other patients. Better to be here than in the hospital, he said. If you were lucky, your body would complete the process naturally and you wouldn't need surgery. When he stepped out, you repeated his words, if you're lucky. I hated him for you and your husband even more when he did show up, for the way he kept turning from you, checking his phone, groaning as if his body were expelling a life and not yours. When we took you home, you asked that I remain in your room with you and not your husband, who did not protest. You begged me to stay the night. You would pay me extra, you said, and I told you there was no need. I stroked your forehead as you fell into the kind of sleep I know was not restful. You were in another dimension, one I recognized from the time I lost a pregnancy, though for me it was more of a relief than a sorrow, because the man I was with at the time did not want to be a father. But the ache was just as morbid, the void, undeniable. In the morning, your husband found me sleeping on his half of the bed. I stood up, embarrassed, but he did not look my way. To him, I was as invisible as ever, his wife's little doll, I presume. He kissed your brow and apologized for having to go to work. You did not respond. Your eyes said you loathed him. We both did. That morning, the room diffused in gray light. We were the same. So, thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. I was so thrilled when you began reading that because it's also available for anybody in the audience on Oprah Daily, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for those who would like to read the story in full. And honestly, what a masterful and generous depiction of the strange and intimate power dynamics between an employer and employee relationship. So thank you all for those readings, such wonderful readings. And we are really sorry that Jaime can't join us today, but I am so excited for our conversation tonight. Before we properly begin the conversation, I wanted to say that ever since the announcement for this event went out, the number of people who expressed to me not just their love for these authors, but how shaken they were and how fundamentally important these works are on a deeply human and personal level to them have been many. These are authors that are deeply, deeply beloved, and it is truly a privilege that we get to spend our evening with them. And I just wanted to pass that love on before we jump into our conversation. Once again, if anyone in the audience has any questions or simply wants to show love to these authors, please make use of the chat section. And if time allows, we'll try our best to get to it all. Now, turning to this evening's conversation, here at the New York Immigration Coalition, immigration is an issue that's close to all our hearts. So for tonight's session, we really wanted to start off by focusing on how immigration and identity isn't singular. And I think that this multiplicity of identities comes out beautifully in each of your works. Could you speak to how intersectionality comes into play, and especially when crafting such nuanced dimensional characters who truly contain multitudes, as we all do?
Are you going to call on somebody?
Whoever felt like jumping in, and then we could take it from there.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Can you just repeat that last part of the question for a second?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak about how intersectionality comes to play in your work when you're crafting these stories and characters.
Yeah, I can start if that. I mean, I feel like, intersectionality was the sort of motivation in some sense for creating the protagonist of my novel, which I didn't read from, but I think that sometimes we, especially with immigrant protagonists or characters or people, we often want to sort of create these clean categories. And in some sense, that can be its own form of oppression because we don't fit into easy categories. And the intersectionality of identity is something that I think is just as available to people from immigrant backgrounds as it is to anybody else. So you can be both, for example, Arab and American. You can be both, Muslim and queer. You can be both, a feminist and wear the hijab. And so for me, it was really important to kind of capture all of that in the characters that I create and to allow them to transcend those categories and, sort of stereotypical kind of ideas of what each can be.
Yeah, I think in my case, I guess over the years, it's become clearer to me through my writing that the more a person has to confront borders in their life, the less they mean to you, the more borderless you become because they just take on ridiculous meanings at a certain point. So for me, I think that I begin in a very small space of just writing about the intimacy of the private lives of characters and grow outwardly from there. I write very typically about characters who live within or around immigrant communities. That's part of their condition. It's an ever-changing, ever-evolving condition to be an inheritor of migration in some way or another, or to be one who has it in their very recent past. And because of that, there's so many dualities. There's so many places and moments and identities that are overlapping and infringing one upon the other. So in a way, I kind of reject it all completely in order to arrive at a truth outside of that space of thinking about categories and to be particular to the characters and really let my characters dictate their own unbordered living.
Yeah, I would just add that, like, when the term intersectionality became more prevalent, I just didn't understand how you would construct identities without acknowledgement of intersections. I just think that would be bad writing and weird flat characters. I don't know if it's even possible to write round characters without an acknowledgement. I think the absence of intersectionality is a sort of strange, nightmare universe where people are reduced to mono identifiers, which I just think is not real. So it just has always been sort of effortless for me. It just seemed very natural, and I think most writers I respect just automatically think like that.
Yeah, I was thinking that the word labels like intersectionality and language that we use has changed over the last couple of years to maybe situate writers within a certain dialogue. I was wondering if you guys feel like that has changed with the prevalence of the internet, with the way stories have had different experiences shaping people's mindsets now that there's so much more access to different kinds of stories and awareness and different voices coming into the dialogue. I noticed the internet also appearing in various stories and works that you guys have published. I'm thinking, Porochista, specifically of the story you wrote of parsnips that went viral internationally, bringing people in from all over the world. And I was so charmed by that.
I'm going to take that, Porochista.
What is the question exactly? Sorry, I just lost the thread.
Yeah, I was just thinking if the internet in recent years, instead of bringing increased access to different kinds of stories and awareness, if that has changed your relationship with your work.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I mean, I guess I came to loving a lot of the literature I do in the 80s and 90s, but I sort of think often of the 90s as a golden age of the works that I really loved. And I was studying Latin American and Latino literature there in college. And of course was always reading Middle Eastern literature. And I can't help but think the literature then almost felt more progressive. So I don't know if the internet, for me, I don't know if it's done what one could imagine its full breadth of possibility. I mean, it's obviously a presence in stories, and the parsnip story, that Facebook was a presence in there, and it was a good vehicle, a plot device. But I don't personally find I mean, I'm very online and I'm very reliant on the internet, and I find it a good source for information and inspiration, but I don't know if it has contributed its full promise, other than connecting us with readers and connecting us with people that we might not have had access to. I don't know if it's actually delivered on this more beautiful promise. I teach the Borges story, the Aleph, often, and in that you could make a case that the object, the Aleph in there, that's this object that sort of encapsulates all things past, present, and future on Earth, from humans to specks of dust, is an analogy for the internet. But in his version of it, it's this glorious sci-fi object that is so tremendous and so beautiful and so breathtaking that it completely transforms the life of these two men. But I don't know if that's happened. I can't help but like, be sort of disappointed by or maybe it's social media that's a little bit disappointing because it has so many negatives on top of the positives. I don't know.
Right. What about everyone else?
I mean, I would agree with Porochista for the most part. I think that there's limitations. There's a lot we've gained in terms of connectivity and shareability and making things more accessible, obviously, through the internet. But I think socially and culturally, it's turned people into critics. It has made people, in some ways, even have a narrower perspective or range of vision for what they want to be exposed to. Everyone's a curator then of their own tastes. And I think there's something to it. The old days, I don't know, maybe it's just because like Porochista and I, maybe our reading selves grew up in a different time, to the slowness of encountering work and spending time with it and thinking about it before being inundated with everyone else's opinions about it and every piece of trivia related to what you just read. So in that sense, I think we still have to strike a balance between what the internet can offer and also the reality of that it's not the answer to all our prayers. And certainly there's limitations to what it can offer an artist who seeks to create and have original thoughts.
Zaina, would you go?
Yeah, I mean, I'm basically, I think I agree 100% with both Porochista and Patricia. But the one thing that's been, I mean, and this is like sort of a little bit slightly maybe different than what you're asking, but I guess the one thing that's been useful has been the fact that the internet has allowed for a proliferation of like, it's created more of a platform for different voices. And for, I mean, traditionally it seems, at least, sorry about the cooing, hang on a second.
Not at all.
It seems that in order, oh my God, the doorbell just rang. I'll get it in a minute. But in order for voices from like a lot of marginalized backgrounds to be heard, I think there were the gatekeepers to publishing were predominantly white, and not only white, but like people that had been here for generations and understood how the system worked. And with the internet, right? I mean, you got this sort of like influx of publications and places where you could publish work that may not have been like, on sale at your local bookstore, but at least you had a link that you could then share, and then it became much easier to access those works by authors from different backgrounds who maybe didn't quite feel that they had room within. And also, one other quick thing that I thought of was that if, let's say, you had an author from a certain background, there was only room for that one author in a publishing house or in a like imprint. It was like, oh, we already have our, Arab writer, what have you. But with the internet and the sort of prevalence of more publications, more visibility of those publications, there is more room to for more writers from, there isn't just the token, Arab writer or Latina writer or, Asian writer. So that's one positive, but overall I'm very not an internet person otherwise. I feel like I'd be happier in a different time and probably a more focused writer. So
I was just responding to what many of you were saying about stories as you were growing up, and wondering then in that case, what were some stories that were so crucial to you, either growing up or in your development as a writer?
Do we just go around or...
Yeah. Oh, would it be more comfortable if I asked? Why don't you go first?
Me?
Uh-huh.
It's hard to say where my writing self began, right? Because I grew up with a lot of stories. When we ran out of books, my father would make up stories for us. So there was always storytelling, and I come from a very, very large Colombian family. It was just like stories all the time, right? But I think my real reading self that matched with the self that knew it wanted to really be a writer, aside from just being a kid who liked writing, but really consciously decided I want to write and make that my life, was around the age of like 14, 15. I think that was a really critical time. And the books that I read around that time that really hit me are still the ones that are my most formative, that I, return to in my mind every time I start something new. So those, don't ask me why. It was a Colombian girl in New Jersey, and these are the books. I don't know how they ended up in my house, but they did. Were the diaries of Albert Camus. I was really into reading the diaries of writers like Anais Nin. My mom would often confiscate that from me, and also Colette. That was what I was into. And Maurice Condé, Toni Morrison, the short stories of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, because of course, as Colombian, my mom was like really, adamant that we read that. And in particular, there's a book called The Four-Chambered Heart by Anais Nin that was very important to me. So these are books that still they're a part of me, and I would say they're really my writer DNA. Of course, there were stories that arrived sooner in my life that were important, and stories and authors that arrived later, but those are still kind of like my first real teachers where I was paying attention. Somehow they were all writers of exile, come to realize later, or diaspora in one way or another. But of course, I wasn't making those connections then.
What about Porochista?
I was reading, other than like Persian fairy tales and sort of more, culturally relevant stuff in our household that my dad was reading, I was really drawn to Southern writers, actually. American Southern writers I loved, mostly because I love the maximalism in the language. And I found the non-Southern writers, I still find that to be really like cold and minimal and just so like distant and aloof in their Americanness. So they never spoke to me, but the rhythms and the language of the Southern writers really, and also their dilemmas, how fraught the South was, and how all the problems of the South seemed sort of unsolvable and epic and really dark. So they really spoke to me. I really fell in love with Faulkner as a pretty young teenager, actually. And his work was very accessible to me, strangely, because of how the language sounded, whereas some other American writers were not. And then I loved Black American writers. I really fell in love with them big time, and then went to the Latin American writers. So I was kind of going through all these different cultures, especially because English was my second language. But I think part of the reason was that short stories, there's not a big tradition of short stories in Persian cultures. We have poetry, and then we have these like epics, and then of course religious writing. So I had to go kind of elsewhere to look to like short stories, and we have novels, but in a way they're secondary to poetry. So I was kind of like looking around, and I was very drawn to international writing. And in the last few years, a lot of my mentors are in East Asia, and I write a lot about East Asian authors. And so I sort of have continued that the extension outside of just my own culture.
I'm so interested to hear maybe later about how you approach different genres of work within your own body of work. But before that, Zaina.
Yeah, gosh, it's funny. It's like so hard to, just an interesting question. And it's like giving me a lot of thought. And I'm realizing that most of the books that were really influential to me and stories often were about either outsiders or told by outsiders, or was literally the book The Outsiders, which like I loved as a kid. And also like I was so, I'm just thinking of like some of my favorite books growing up. Like I loved Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. That was like, I think the book that made me want to be a writer. And I never, because the majority of my schooling was in the States, and I never encountered authors that shared my background. But I encountered other authors that were, or like that shared. I never encountered like Arab writers actually, for most of like elementary and high school. And I didn't really come from a house of books either. So, my parents didn't really introduce me to that. And it was only sort of later in life that I took it upon myself to, read work by other Middle Eastern authors. But I certainly, I remember I loved Gabriel Garcia Marquez in high school. I loved Toni Morrison in high school. I mean, those were like my two favorite writers when I was younger, and was just always really taken by really character-driven books where the characters were in some sense like out of place. I mean, including Catcher in the Rye, but like so does, everyone loves that one. So yeah, I was just trying to think of like what linked all the books that I liked the most. And it's like, oh, always about outsiders. So
Thank you for sharing. Well, you read earlier from an essay, but I had also just finished your novel, which I really loved. And I was just wondering how all of you approach, the different forms of writing within your practice, and how do you define maybe this seems like a, pretty simple question, but how do you approach each new piece and define the container before you begin? Or does that come quite naturally as it unfolds?
for me, I just jumped to answer because
Oh, no, please. Yeah.
I think for me, the container is always like a question that I want to answer. That's like the best way I can think of to start something and to like focus what it is I like. If I have a genuine question that's like burning inside me, or that like I've encountered and I really want to, that is the container that drives whatever it is I'm writing about, be it a story, like a piece of fiction or an essay. Because like and usually the process of writing the story or the essay is like the process of trying to answer the question. And I don't think I sometimes I don't even get to the answer, but it's just, that's the story, or the essay is like the inquiry. So yeah.
I think in my case, I sit with the story for a very long time before I start writing anything, just because it helps me to not write myself into a wall. If I start prematurely before I have a real, sense of where it's going. So usually by then I kind of have an intuition if it's going to be short form or long form. I have been wrong a couple of times, and then I'll just start over. And I've even been wrong later down the road when I wrote something that was a short story, and then years later, I wrote a short story many years ago called The Bridge, and it was published like a short story, and I thought it was a short story, and it's really the only story that kind of sat on my shoulder, like demanding more attention. And years later, I returned to it, and it became the first chapter of my novel, The Veins of the Ocean. That has only happened once. But usually I think I just wait. I just really wait for it to kind of announce itself, and it'll change shape. It'd be a shorter short story, or a longer short story, or a shorter novel, or a longer novel. But still, I have a sense of what direction it's going before I start.
Yeah, I wish I had a neater methodology, but like all my projects just sort of seem to have their own rules, and they always really surprised me. And so I've had short stories that have taken like 20 years to write, and like novel drafts that I've written in like a few months. It does seem to be that novels are easier to me to write than short stories, strangely. I find short stories really mysterious and counterintuitive, and almost always when I read a published short story, I don't really know what it means. I don't know what the author's intention was, and I don't like that mystery. Actually, I'm like somewhat resentful. I feel like I'm back to like English as a second language, where I'm just like, what? I always feel like it's like prematurely ending. I don't love short stories, honestly. I just finished a short story collection that I just turned in, but I don't really trust the form the way that I do novels, which feel really natural to me. And I think that's probably because I grew up reading them. And then, nonfiction is just a totally different thing for me. It's really somewhat easy, but that's because I really distance it from art, and I just focus on information and communication. Style is very important to me in my fiction, but not so much in my nonfiction. I think it could actually be a little bit like intrusive if it's overly stylized. So I know that's because I was a trained journalist. So I think it's just different modes. But yeah, everything just has its own rules. And I think you just have to respect the project for what it is.
I was hoping to bring the conversation also like back into conversation with immigration. So I was wondering where in the writing process for each of you, as you craft your work, do issues of immigration come into play?
I mean, I don't think of it as issues. I don't ever really write thinking about, I'm going to write about this issue or that. I just write about the worlds that I know and I've occupied and the people that are interesting to me and that I care about. To some people, that's an issue. And to other people, that's just Tuesday. So that's also a strange space to be in when your life kind of becomes objectified in that way, because it's been determined to be problematic in some way by some people, like a puzzle to be figured out when you're just living life. So what interests me most are the communities that I know and I love, and the people that I admire, and usually within the framework of interpersonal relationships, their families, their intimate relationships, and their desires and their connections to their points of origin, and that often that comes up in conflict against where they are now. Okay, is that talking about immigration? Well, that's just really the story of movement that everyone's story occupies in one way or another. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think that way in terms of writing with an agenda or messaging or things like that. It's really just coming back to human stories every single time, probably because as a reader, that's the only thing that interests me. I'm certainly not motivated by issues when I read, or messaging when I read fiction or anything like that. It's just human stories.
Yeah, I don't think I think so consciously of it either, but I think immigrants interest me in that they're outsiders. But I think that says something about my view of immigration, which is not a rosy view. So I'm on immigration panels all the time, and but I don't like almost nothing that I write gives a very positive view of immigration. I don't think it's a happy story necessarily, especially for Iranians or Iranian Muslims, definitely, because our status is always threatened, like I said, with the Muslim ban in my piece, or even with Trump's concept that naturalized citizens could have their citizenship revoked. So it doesn't ever feel comfortable here as an immigrant, but that's interesting to me. The discomfort is interesting. So I like the idea of writing about outsiders of all sorts. I think sort of like a born and bred, grateful, happy, well-adjusted American to me is not really interesting. Even when I meet those people in real life, they don't feel interesting to me. They don't feel real. And so I don't really, I find it sort of suspect when I meet people that like have a very rosy and comfortable view of their Americanness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I mean, both what Patricia and Porochista said completely resonates with me, and I love that line of like, it's not an issue, it's just Tuesday, because that's exactly kind of how I feel as well as a writer. And then when it comes to like, it just so happens to be that the characters in most of my stories are either immigrants or first generation or what have you. But I just remember once, I'm just reminded of this time that I was like leading a workshop for DACA recipients and dreamers, and they were talking about how they feel like they always have to tell their story of kind of coming to America versus like sometimes they're like, we just want to write a story that's like set on Mars or something like that, or is in no way related to that experience. And I found that to be that resonated, where it's like this expectation that's placed upon immigrants or people from that are first generation to sort of tell those stories that maybe they want to tell other stories, and like to allow that space feels really important and kind of essential. So anyway, I just thought of that as I was listening to this conversation.
Yeah. We have a question from the audience, actually. So from Yvette. Yvette is asking, I am curious, what is it about writing as an art specifically for each of you to express? What is it about writing as an art specifically for each of you to express the depth of your and your characters' experiences? So would any of you like to take that? I guess another way of looking at that question would be, if you could speak to your relationship to writing in expressing the depth of their experiences.
I mean, I think in my case, I mean, every artist has the nature of an artist, and then I think your medium finds you at some point.
Mhm.
I come from a family of musicians and painters, and so when I, was a kid, I thought I would be a painter. But I don't know, it was like writing kind of just invaded my mind. And as soon as I learned how to write, I started, writing captions to my drawings, and those took over and became stories. Because I guess, I come from a storytelling culture in a lot of ways, and a huge gossipy family. So a lot of stuff happening constantly. So it was natural. And also I was no good at music or anything like that. But I think that need to express yourself is common and particular to people who have the temperament and disposition for needing to express themselves in some sort of way. Not everybody has it, but writing for me has become really liberating. And I think anybody will tell you that in a lot of ways it's a compulsion. You can't not write. You might have harder days with it. You might resent it, or but it'll knock you over if you don't do it. At a certain point, you can avoid it for a year or two or three, like a lot of us do when life gets in the way. But it's still going to be there. And sometimes I'm writing stories while I'm folding laundry or looking after my child as well. It's still in the writer's mind, no matter what you do. So. A long way to say, I think it chooses you.
Out of curiosity, how old were you when you started writing captions on your pictures? Would you write? Yeah, was it like a childhood practice?
Oh yeah, as soon as I could. I mean, my mom is like an archivist of doodles, and she passed last year, and so I found a lot of her stuff, and she was saving these drawings, and they went from my little stick figure drawings and to having little stories under them. So I don't know, 5, 6, 7, whenever you learn how to write sentences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, this question is actually very complicated in a way, like why writing, but I would say that I was sort of drawn to arts in general, and writing for me was the cheapest because you didn't need all those supplies, and my parents, really couldn't afford any of that other stuff. Like I also was interested in painting, but like it wasn't financially possible. And so I remember having incredible anxiety about the idea of like a typewriter even, and then like a computer. I was horrified that those would be a cost that would prevent me from being a writer, because I was just writing on pencil and paper. And so that just to me seemed like fine. I knew I was creative at a very young age, and I was sort of interested in all the arts, but I was just sort of pragmatic about it. I just thought it would be like less expensive. And our life was so, leaving Iran during the revolution and wartime, like it just, everything was about like what was like financially possible. So the big challenge there was learning English, but also because I was teased so much for not speaking English properly, that was also another challenge. And that also seemed like a good triumph to be able to like master this language, like to like look at these like white kids that are like, you can't speak English, and then be like, one day you're gonna regret that. Like I had this idea that I could, I think it's important. I mean, I think a lot of writers at a young age have a sense of their like intelligence maybe, or their imagination. I mean, it's not that I thought books were easy to write, but I just thought like I could do this. And I love that confidence that like little kids have. And so I just thought like, oh, these bullies, like, that would be kind of funny if like later in life they would have to like read my books.
And your confidence is absolutely correct, because here you are. Speaking, I was also thinking of the excerpt that you were reading, where you also spoke about the visual vocabulary of assimilation. So that's not really a question. I just wanted to appreciate the excerpt that you were reading. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, before you said that it was the cheapest, I was thinking, like, exactly that it's the, it's almost like, as it kind of in a cheeky way. I mean, it is like the most effective way to reach people with the lowest overhead cost in some sense. Like, I mean, being a filmmaker, forget about it. But like, I do think language and like growing up in maybe a bilingual household might have some. It's making me think. I'm like, I wonder if why I was drawn to writing was because I was so excluded for a while. You know, when I was a child, I grew up learning English at school, and my parents were speaking Arabic at home. And though I, did learn Arabic in the process, I still often was unable to understand much of what they were saying. And so in some sense, writing became this world for me that I could have access to, that I didn't have access to, to the language my parents were speaking at the dinner table. So I mean, it's strange because I never realized that most people grow up understanding what their parents are like talking about. And that's probably really beneficial in some ways because you have all this extra knowledge that, you get just by virtue of existing in the house with two adults. But at the same time, not understanding, I don't know, I guess might be part of what led me to writing. And maybe also not understanding, when we would go overseas, there was a lot of cultural norms and expectations that I didn't quite get. So I sort of felt this impulse to make sense of those observations. And at the time, all I had was a notebook. But yeah, as Patricia said, it becomes an impulse, and it becomes, it's compulsive. I feel like I can only think through the tip of a pen at this point in my life, or at this point for the last however many years that I've been a writer. So, yeah. And as you said too, Patricia, you might not do it for a while because life can get in the way, but that doesn't really change that impulse and that I don't know, desire to do it and to process thoughts through it and process characters and tell stories, I guess.
I think that leads in really nicely into another question that we have from an audience member, Emily. She says, thank you all so much for sharing your beautiful writings and stories. What advice might you give an aspiring writer that is not quite sure where to start? Patricia, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, there's no shortcuts and there's no secrets. If you want to be a writer, you got to write. So just show up for your writing the same way you would show up to meet your friend for coffee or for a doctor's appointment. Take it seriously and show up for yourself. That's the only way. Sometimes I meet aspiring writers who want to be writers, but they don't actually write. Or the same thing, they don't read. So you should also be reading as much as possible. And the combination of the two, committing to a writing practice and a reading practice, a broad reading practice, will take you a long way.
Yeah, I was going to emphasize the reading. I think that's really important, more than the writing, really, because you can always tell people that haven't read enough. And I think that's a very, very precious part of the process. And then I think also just to add, to make sure you live, and have experiences. And I think the pandemic did something strange where it sort of encouraged this fetish almost that Americans have for introversion, which often sounds like misanthropy to me. I hate when introversion memes and introversion discussions happen because it's so obvious there so much of it is veiled misanthropy. I just don't like people. Oh, not people, and that's really here in America. I don't really hear other people of other cultures talking about how much they hate human beings. So you shouldn't. I think it's a real disability for a writer to hate human beings, and to have no curiosity about human beings. So the writers that think it's a good idea to be a writer because you can get away from people and just hide, that's no. I don't think that is good. I think you should be someone who enjoys being out in the world and is curious and wants to learn about other people and that's I think the personality traits of writers are really important because there's obviously the discipline and all that, but I think that sort of desire to connect with people and learn about people is really important.
Yeah, again, 100% agree with both, like with both of you, and I think also, you know, showing up for your writing and can also involve, like, yes, to be a writer, you've got to write, and indeed, it can be tricky to like know where to start or like know where to focus your writing on, like what to focus on and what story to pursue and what, you know. So I think two things can be really helpful. One is to create like external accountability. At least that's been helpful. That was helpful for me. Like I would, when I first started writing, I remember I was like submitting things, and it doesn't mean that they're always going to get published, but it at least means that like you're honing in on a piece such that you wanted to get to that level of, you know, publication, and that helps you to finish it. And also I had a I had like a Facebook blog when I first started writing, because I was living in Boston. I knew nobody because I'd moved there for like an internship, and I also wanted to connect. I'm extroverted, and also I totally love what you said about that American like fetish of introversion. But I was lonely, and so I was like writing a blog, and that actually really helped me to like keep going because I felt accountable somehow to like a readership. So accountability, I think, is really helpful. I know I said there were two things, but I forgot what the other one was. I'm sorry. New mom, my brain's like things go in and out. But yeah. Oh, the second one was to sometimes like what can help you to know what to focus on is to like step away from what you're writing and see what you want to return to, you know? I think that's really helpful, is like, and that's a good opportunity to like get out in the world and live as well, is to step away sometimes and come back to it. It can be like stepping away for an hour or 2 hours or a week or 2 weeks. So that's my advice.
I was also wondering if there was any practices that you guys implemented or would advise a younger writer or more emerging writer to implement in terms of protecting themselves and their work as they are developing.
That's a good question. I think that's a question I'm still answering, right? And I think that's also up to the writer. Different writers have different practices that work for them. So it's also a process of discovering yourself as a writer and your methods, what will get you through, right? Taking a project to completion, you know, what sustains you. I mean, I have my own taste, my own preferences, but again, that's just specific to me. It's not like I would say another writer has to do that. Like, just for example, I prefer to write by natural light. I can't really write at night. I just kind of get sleepy and drowsy. I prefer to write by silence. I'll show you what I do. These are my notebooks.
Oh, wow. Oh, I love all the little tabs. The colors.
Yeah, that's how I tell them apart, because they're all the same as, you know, I put stickers all over them. But yeah, there's my tabs. I don't know if you can see.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I kind of organize my thoughts as I'm writing, and I keep them all next to me, and that's just how I move through it. You know, it's my very loose, very unrefined method of outlining or planning or blueprinting or something. And again, that's just a process of trial and error, of trying it before and realizing I can't get through writing a book without having support from my own notes. So it's I love to hear what works for other writers, though, because I'm always learning from other writers too. So I'd love to hear from the other two.
I don't really have a good answer for this. I think a big thing you have to decide early on is if you're a writer that really wants to share with others and have like reading and writing groups, or if you're like a solitary writer. Like I maybe because I've just done workshops for so many years, both been in them and conducted them, that like for me, oversharing, like I know writers have huge groups of people that they show their work to before it comes out. Like I don't like that, actually. Too many voices, I find like it's really diluting and really confuses me. So I keep readers really small, and sometimes I don't even show anyone anything. Like I don't at this point really feel I need to. I find it sometimes strange, writers that are have been writing for a long time, they're so dependent on the readers. And I just don't understand. I think it's really important to hone your own skills and to really listen to your own intuition. So, but there are other writers who work really differently. So I think that's somewhere that sometimes people can start, is deciding like how much of it you keep private and then you release into the world, and how that works, because there is a very big public-private dichotomy in our art that, you know, eventually it is for public consumption. Eventually you need the readers, and you really need the readers more than they need you, because writers are readers also, but readers are not also writers necessarily. So it's, and you know, and we really need them to animate our like a narrative. So yeah, I think that's always like a big question for me, that relationship.
Yeah, I completely agree with too many voices is like that. Yeah, you can often run the risk of like losing touch with your instincts, and also sometimes like what you're doing doesn't necessarily lend itself to well, you sort of have to like keep faith in whatever your vision is, because you might be pushing like working on something that's sort of unusual in its structure or in content or what have you, and it may, I don't know, if you don't want to be discouraged early on. Maybe there's a time to bring in readers. At least for me, I think there's a time to bring in readers, and it isn't always like early in the process. But I mean, little like quirky things that I like to start writing a piece by hand when I first begin something, and then sort of move on to the computer. That, I don't know why, but that's just helpful to me, because it's like, I mean, there's the blank page of a Microsoft Word document, but the blank page of a notebook is that much more, I don't know, just like makes my imagination work in ways that that are kind of fun. And then of course I just forgot again what I was going to say, but I used to like, what was really important to me was to wake up really early and write before checking email or checking my phone or checking the news or anything at all from the outside world, just to have that focus. I mean, focus is such an important part of writing. It just, like, for me at least, like, it just allowing me to sort of see my thoughts or access the world that I'm creating, or like return to the page such that I'm like right back in the world, is so important and hard to do with all of the distraction of everyday life. Nowadays, it's harder to wake up, before a 5-month-old. So I actually find that writing at night has become, well, the times that I'm able to write, it's at night. And that's because, again, it's like the world is sort of shut out in some sense, where it's like, okay, people have gone to sleep. The expectations on me, I'm not getting emails from students, I mean, like, usually, or I'm not checking them at that point. Or, the external world is a little quieter, so it helps me to focus. So, and I think another thing, advice for, you said, like, when you're starting, I think, and maybe for young writers, is like, avoid comparison. Avoid comparison. It's really hard to do in our current world of social media and Instagram and whatever the hell. But, like, seriously, I think that stuff can be so toxic and, like, debilitating. And just, like, I mean, even for me, like, that to this day, if I like see sometimes I'm still affected by all that, and I have to just like block that out when I want to write and leave that behind and not compare myself, because life, it's not a race, and it's also not, I mean, it's all about like your individual sort of stories and creativity and vision, and it can get clouded by a lot of that noise.
Do you have any special, maybe not, do you have any practices that you implement in order to create this space where you can only write and not have other voices come in? So, I've heard some writers use software like Freedom that blocks out the internet. And I also have heard of writers who have a different room in their house, or they write under the cover of like a blanket in order to simulate a different brain space. Really? Yeah, so I was wondering if...
I mean, there were times where I've like put my phone on the bottom of a drawer underneath this and that, and that's actually quite helpful, to just like have those things in a different room, or even like my computer, which is, I guess, why I like to write by hand initially, is because then it's not near me. I can't. Yeah.
No notifications on a piece of paper. You can't just...
Right, exactly. You can't get notifications in a notebook, thankfully.
Well, I really feel like I want to be conscious of everyone's time, but I am so appreciative of all your time and spending time with us today. But I do want to wrap up with one last question for you all, which is, what is your relationship to hope in your writing?
You want me to start?
Yeah. Okay.
Relationship to hope. Wow, that's a big and beautiful question. It's not. I think it's not just in writing; it's just to life in general. I don't know if it's specific to my family, because my family's had some really shitty luck. But sometimes it seems that people with really shitty luck are the people with the most hope. And the clan that I'm from is almost like pathologically optimistic. So hope is something that I reach for kind of habitually, and not to say it always comes easy, but maybe I've been conditioned for that. So hope is something that it's a muscle I try to flex in my own life as much as possible, and because that's so common in the communities that I'm a part of. It's very typical of my characters as well, that even if it leads them down some problematic roads, more often than not, they're guided by some sort of hope. I think that's really hope is like this with desire, right? So often the two, and add another finger to it, and there's love, right? And all these things combined are what carry a lot of us through our whole life and all our life choices. And a lot of wonderful stories come from that space. So it's definitely part of what I do.
I think for me, it's just like the act of writing is a hopeful act in itself. So like just creating something out of nothing, right, to me is very beautiful in itself. And so I don't think my work is always hopeful, and I don't think I'm necessarily a very hopeful person. And it's very, very hard to be hopeful with the world being where it is these days. But I think all creative acts and works of art have an inherent hopefulness to them. I mean, there's really no other meaning to it than to imagine like creating something that endures beyond you and reaches people like way beyond your own imagination and conception. So that, to me, just that generating and that creating, to me, seems really inherently hopeful.
Yeah, I love this question, and I love these answers. And I guess it makes me think about, like, often when in terms of hope, like I find that when, like, I'll create a character that might be sort of, what's the word, like, just challenging to follow or frustrating or like I don't know, like tragic, maybe. We'll say tragic. And like, I think the hope, the project is to sort of find that point of empathy for that character. And I think that point of empathy is where hope sort of lies in some sense. I mean, that is in many ways what I felt my job as a writer is to kind of find the point of empathy for characters that seem tragic or pathetic or hopeless in some way. And that's the sort of fun project of it, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful answers and for this wonderful conversation. I can also see in the chat that people are thanking you for such an immensely enriching conversation and the ability and opportunity to hear your writing. So I can't wait to read everything else that comes out from you guys. Like, thank you so much for this evening and this conversation. And I would like to bring Michael back, who is going to close us out.
Thank you.
Jaime, thank you so much. And to Zaina, Patricia, and Porochista, thank you so much. My friend just sent me a text and said, "Hi, this is so four so's great." And in case, here we are all kind of electronically walled off in our soundproof YouTube cocoon. So if I could encourage everyone to stand up and give a standing ovation, I sure would. Just a thanks again to our sponsors, to Akashic Books, to the New York Writers Coalition, to Nancy Goldhill and Bob Master, to the shipment agency, Singapore Unbound, and We Are Chimmy. And if you feel so moved and would love to donate to the New York Immigration Coalition and all of its important work across New York City and New York State, it's the link is in your chat, and it's NYIC.org/donate. NYIC.org/donate. I'm Michael Hirschhorn, one of the board members of the New York Immigration Coalition, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.